Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
At a talk recorded on the 3rd of November 2014, Peter Stark discussed the mismatch in cultural funding between London and the rest of England.
Thanks very much indeed, Jennifer. I was quite pleased with the title of that Jennifer and I worked out because I'm partly going to be talking about the research work that we've been doing and my perception of the regional and national position at the moment for the arts in England. But I'm also wanting to talk a bit about the necessity to rock the boat from time to time, and in the particular circumstances that I found myself in when I came back from South Africa. So that's what I'm tackling tonight. Two things. As you may know, we've over the past year, my colleagues David Powell, Christopher Gordon, and I have published 3 reports. Rebalancing Our Cultural Capital, the RoC report, Policy for the Lottery, Arts and Community in England, the Place report, and about 4 weeks ago, Hard Facts to Swallow. So we've got RoC, Hard and Place in our titles, and anybody would have thought that we'd planned it that way. Well, we didn't, but it kind of worked out that way, and it feels about right. I also have to share a small difficulty with you in that the RoC report in particular was part of the causes of the House of Commons Select Committee on Culture deciding to run an inquiry into the remit and role of Arts Council England with particular regard to the balances and imbalances of funding between London and the rest of the country. And given that we've planned this evening for 6 or 7 months, it is entirely fortuitous that at 1 minute past midnight in the early hours of this morning, I actually got an embargoed copy of that report. And I am under threat of immolation in the tower if I publish it. And as podcasting counts as publishing, also my beginner's guide to infringement of whatever tells me. I'm certainly in the early part of this evening, I'm going to have to be a little bit careful. Suffice to say, however, that at the moment, my natural optimism, I think when I worked with John Fox at Welfare State, we used to call ourselves pathological optimists. And I've managed to carry that through a long career. My glass is always half full. It's because I keep topping it up. So I bring you a sunny smile rather than a gloomy countenance as a background for what I'm going to say. Okay, I feel that I arrive here from 2 foreign countries. The first of those is the past, the place where things are done differently. I've increasingly, as I've got older, become more and more aware of the importance, the critical importance of understanding the past in relation to any action that we might attempt to change the future. And I am now officially a designated heritage object in my own right. I am studied by the Victoria and Albert Museum Archive and sundry researchers at various new universities around the country who seem to want to come and prod me and ask me questions about the early days of the transformed Arts Council in the late 60s and early 70s, and I'll be touching on that. The second different country that I come to you from is having spent 10 to 12 years living and working and learning in South Africa, an extraordinary country going through an extraordinary set of transitions carried by some of the most extraordinary people that I've ever had the privilege of knowing in my life. And I suppose the things that comparatively late in my life I learned from my time in South Africa was firstly patience, which is something that I didn't always have in large supply when I was here before. And secondly, a degree of humility and remembrance, particularly a remembrance of what it was like in the late 60s and the late 60s, very early 70s, as an arts activist in this country, where there was absolutely no expectation of any public funding at all in what motivated us to do what we did. It will be extraordinary to the younger people in the room to know that there was no funding for local arts work, no funding for experimental or touring or small-scale dance or small galleries or anything. Nothing. Not something, nothing. And that is exactly the situation that I found moving to South Africa in the year 2000. The high hopes, the high expectations of new funding for the arts in the new country had not come to fruition. There were other far more important priorities for the government. And if you wanted to do art, if you wanted to dance, if you wanted to tell stories, if you wanted to make films, you had to just find ways to do it. And people did, and continue to do so in what is an extremely frustrating, difficult, inconsistent, incompetent on occasions funding environment. And remembering that root in why we do things in the arts was a really important thing that I brought back to this country when I came back in 2012. And so I returned in 2012 to a sector, the arts in England, in the UK, that I knew really well in memory, and to a part of the world, the northeast of England, that I also felt I knew really well. But I was perhaps wise enough to know that such remembered realities in a time of very rapid social, technological, political, etc. change leaves heffalump traps for the unwary, holes for large people to stumble into. So I tried to approach relearning this place with a degree of caution and a degree of recognition that I was, in a sense, a kind of grumpy old man, likely and to be at risk of going, well, it wasn't like that in my day. Or as my colleague David Powell said, we're in danger of becoming nothing but a collection of old anecdotes. And these are traps to be wary of. And at the same time, I was aware of the dead ground that was in front of us again, that we were moving into a period where very few of the certainties that had informed our work and our practice through the late 70s, the 80s, the 90s, add the lottery into the 2000s, suddenly the financial crisis, the advent of the coalition government, had produced a world that my instincts weren't in tune with. So it took me a long time to accept that what I was feeling back in my sector, back in my region, back in my country, was a deep uneasiness, a sense that something had gone wrong whilst I'd been away. No causal relationship with my having been away, but just a sense that something had happened which had changed and which I needed to try and find out what it was. And the first and most important one of those was a couple of trips that I played to London and to the southeast of England. And the realization that the gulf, the gap between that very wealthy part of the country and our northeast and other parts of the north had widened very substantially in feel, in essence, in taste. The places had diverged over a decade in a very significant way. The second related to the sector. What people were saying to me in private, in the pub over dinner, was profoundly at odds with what was being said in public. There was something going on which there was an atmosphere which just felt to me to be wrong in some way. And I started doing a little bit of anecdotal, occasional research. I read up on the Arts Council stakeholder survey, which they conduct every year, and noticed that despite the fact that the people who were questionnared and were picked by the Arts Council, they were only getting a 35%, 40% return. That seemed odd. Liz Hill, the very, very able and committed publisher of Arts Professional, told stories of when she hit a particular story and published it that was in some way critical of the funding body, she would get a big spike in readership and then a complete fall off in any social media transmission of commentary about it. Suddenly there was silence. There was great interest, and then suddenly there was silence. And it became apparent to me that there was no alternative voice. There was no critical voice. There was no critical debate going on in our country about cultural policy. It had been battened down. In some way it seemed to have been controlled. Even the local authorities, even the supposedly oppositional local authorities of the Labour-controlled authorities, were silent. And I was troubled by this. And I went back to the history of the arts in this part of the world which we live in. Many of you will know this. I'll just gloss it. But it was the local authorities of this region, the Labour local authorities of this region, that came together in 1963 to form the North East Association for the Arts. And they did so because they recognized that they could do more together. They could do things together that they couldn't do individually. Most of them were very small, still are, by comparison. But there was an absolute commitment. There was a zeitgeist. There was a willingness within the Labour authorities, built out of the traditions of a self-actualizing working class. I mean, the Pitman painters would be the classic example of it, but there are many others here and in Wales and in Scotland of a commitment. I'm a singer. My family's a singing family. And I was brought up, my great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father were all members of the Blaydon Male Voice Choir. And I sang with them, with my grandfather and my father, as a young boy. And I sang from tonic solfa. I didn't sing from the stave. I sang from tonic solfa. And we sang, around the family piano, we sang the Geordie songs. But what we were singing in the Blaydon Male Voice Choir was Schubert Lieder. And that working class tradition of interest in and hunger for another culture, of enriching the lives of the people, of the people of the region, was very, very real. And the local authorities in 1963 put £40,000 together, £40,000 together, and went to the Arts Council and asked them to match it. And the Arts Council, we've seen the minutes now, had a debate and decided they couldn't really trust something as precious as culture with these strange people from the northeast of England, so they offered them £500. That was a mistake. You don't do that. And at that point, you get in the Labour Party in England the growth of the impetus that leads to the 1965 White Paper, still the only white paper on the arts, that Jenny Lee put through under Harold Wilson's government. And because it's something I'm going to come back to before I finish, I'll just read you a couple of quotes from that. This is Jenny Lee in 1964. If a sane balance of population between north and south, east and west is to be achieved, this kind of development, regional and local facilities for the arts, is just as essential as any movement of industry or provision of public utility service. If the eager and gifted, to whom we must look for leadership in every field, are to feel as much at home in the north and west as in and near London, each region will require high points of artistic excellence. And that produces this extraordinary document, which I commend to you to read, which right at the last minute, the senior civil service discovered and disliked. And we've also found a briefing document from Sir Burke Trend to Harold Wilson in 1964, trying to persuade the Prime Minister and Jenny Lee that this radical policy of investment at local level throughout the country needed to be adjusted. So Sir Burke Trend writes in a memo to Harold Wilson, and I can't resist doing the Sir Humphrey bit, so forgive me. The draft white paper concentrates on the need to develop artistic activities and enjoyment outside London, particularly by the encouragement of regional and local arts associations and arts centres. This presentation can perhaps be justified in relation to the government's industrial and social policies for regional and regeneration. But it is very noticeable that the work of the great national institutions is taken for granted in the white paper, and in the sense that they are not singled out for any degree of special mention and do not feature in the section on the government's proposals. So we have then, as now, a set of metropolitan institutions and interests that speak of the arts in the provinces as being of a second level of importance, a second level of quality, and deserving of a different level of attention to that which might apply in the capital. And so by the time I've done the history, by the time I've grounded my unease in a lack of debate, I'm returning to this question of rocking the boat and when it's the right thing to do and when you need to ignore the people who say, sit down, you're rocking the boat. And I want to talk about 3 observations on leadership in the cultural sphere. The first is that when I started in the arts in this country, the people who were the administrators of the arts in this country were called secretaries. We were secretaries to the board, or secretaries to the trust, or secretaries to the artist or the artistic director. That was what our position was, very clear. Roy Shaw, Secretary General of the Arts Council, had to spend 2 years convincing the Arts Council to set up a course for arts administrators. And it was felt appropriate in 1971 that 12 such people should be trained each year at a polytechnic, not a university, and that was the assessed number of arts administrators that might be necessary in the country. It wasn't long before we were all arts managers, and then cultural managers, and then cultural leaders. And it seems to me that this country is currently producing about 100 to 150 qualified cultural leaders each year. plus in-service training to bring on everybody and draw out their cultural leadership potential. Now, I'm all for continuing professional development. I'm all for lifelong learning. I'm all for everything else. I have to tell you, leadership is different. Leadership is different. And my definition of leadership, I take from the American Bob Terry, who says leadership in any field is the courage to bring forth authentic action in the commons. The courage to bring forth authentic action in the commons. And I find that of particular relevance for us in the arts and culture. Because if we are not about the authentic and the truth in what we make in the arts or what we study and try to understand in the objects or stories or natural world that form our heritage, then we are about nothing. And we who are in service of that are in danger of leading very truncated and disempowered and awkward lives. So I take it in the arts that if we are about the authentic, then we must ask of our structures, of the organizations that we create and run, that they have a similar authenticity, that they are prepared to speak truth to each other without fear. And I didn't think that was what was happening. And then I stumbled on Stephen Covey's wonderful definition of the difference between strategic management and leadership. And this is my bridge to the last bit of what I want to say. Stephen Covey says that the strategic manager is a very clear, and it's a very important role. The workshops have been done. The staff have been consulted. The stakeholders have been consulted. The whiteboards have been covered in stickies and cokers, and everything has been pulled together. The direction is clear. The objective is clear. The aims are clear. The team is together. They are on their way through the forest, out to the other side. They know where they're going. And the strategic manager is at the front with the machete, in the middle, leading the singing, at the back, looking after the stragglers. That's where we're going. The leader is up the tallest tree saying, wrong forest. And you can't do that every day. You can't do that every year. You can't do that every 3 years. But just suddenly, sometimes, somebody has to say wrong forest. And I came to the conclusion, my colleagues and I came to the conclusion that the arts in this country were in the wrong forest in two senses. One, there was another forest we should have been in. And the second, that the forest we were in had too much that was wrong about it and within it. So we did our research, which you can see our reports on our website, GPS Culture. They're all there. I'm not going to recite endless numbers to you tonight. The case that the taxpayers' money for the arts and culture in this country distributed nationally is at 14 times the level per head of population in London to that which it is in the rest of the country is proven. It is accepted, it is not argued. It is also accepted that it's wrong and something needs to be done about it, but it had not been placed as starkly into the commons until we did so. The fact that when the Arts Council says there's a trend, it's only 30% in London, it's only 40% in London, it's only 50% in London. Every year that any one of those statistics is true, the situation is getting steadily and incrementally worse. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. It might be slowing down slightly in how much worse it's getting each year, but essentially the situation continues to get worse. And what is portrayed as a triumph of policy intervention is actually no such thing. It's merely a public relations dressing of unpalatable facts, which are extremely difficult, if not impossible, to address through the current structures and the long-term structures of interest which inform the operation of our National Cultural Department and our National Arts Council. So, wrong. It was wrong that that ratio applied. It's wrong that only 17% of the local authority areas in this country have a surplus on their arts lottery account. Only 17%. Gateshead's one of them, but not many others in the Northeast are. It's wrong that local authorities such as Westminster, that have cut all of their arts spending, have done so with complete impunity in terms of any sanction being visited upon them by an arts council which is spending hundreds of millions of pounds each year in the city of Westminster. Whereas any authority outside London that begins to try to cut its budget is subject to public and private negative PR, which is fair enough. I mean, I'm all for trying to ensure that people keep funding the arts, but the disparity, as my colleague and ex-professor John Pick used to say, if you want to understand English arts policy since the war, it can best be understood by an acute desire not to be embarrassed at dinner. That's worth a laugh. It's a very good line. And it's horribly true. So, where are we? I finally came to one wrongness that that is current. The Arts Council is about to publish its holistic case for culture, or holistic case for the arts. And in doing so, it is going to claim for the arts a whole series of outputs and impacts. And it is going to claim those in a context where its chairman, in the introduction to the review of research that it just did, made the following extraordinary statement. Sir Peter Bazalgette writes, "We do not cherish the arts because of their impact on our social well-being or cohesion, our physical or mental health, our education system, our national status or economy. Instead, we cherish them because of their intrinsic value, how they illuminate our inner lives and enrich our emotional world." Now that is a rhetorical device called the juxtaposition of false opposites. Right? What he's saying is he's contrasting, rather than saying we cherish the arts for this reason and for this reason, he's saying we do this, not this. Right? He sets up a false opposite and then defines himself against it. And there is no doubt in all of our lived experience, in all of the work that almost all of us do, that we have a complex of reasons for doing things, a complex of public service outputs that we can reasonably expect when we have stewardship of the public's money. This is not to deny in any way the importance of the intrinsic value of work which is produced, but it lives within a social and an economic context, and it is the public's money, whether spent involuntarily through tax or voluntarily through the lottery. And we have argued that we need a cultural policy which accepts all of those responsibilities and seeks to find balances within them, whether geographical or based on class or based on other factors. So where do we find ourselves? We've published our reports. The Select Committee will utter at midnight on Wednesday, and it should be in some media on Wednesday. I think we're at a point where we have to go back to basics again. And there are basically two that I think we have to build on. And they're the two things that happen anywhere, anytime, with or without funding, and we have to start building our case for the arts up again from there. And it seems to me that the two things that happen anywhere, anytime are these. First of all, people will always look to find opportunities locally where they live to share the experience of a song or a joke or a story or a dancing or a dance piece or whatever. It's wired into our DNA as human beings that we do those things. And somehow in the arts, we've got a complete void when it comes to a national policy that might address how we build local cultural lives, what we call in voluntary arts in our new initiative, our cultural commons. We point out there that many of us will get the opportunity to travel. Those of us who are fortunate enough will get an opportunity to travel and experience arts elsewhere. But for all of us, our cultural life is first and last local. At the beginning and the end of our lives, our opportunities to experience the arts are digital, but they're also bound up with where we are and the local facilities that exist. It's almost impossible not to juxtapose the grounding of sport and recreation policy in this country in a broad, wide participative base, and an arts policy which ignores that base and doesn't speak to it, doesn't value it, doesn't seek to empower it, doesn't seek to protect it at this present time of great challenge to facilities that have been built up and programs over the years. So that's on the one hand. On the other, there are strange and wondrous people who are driven or choose, or a mixture of both, to commit their lives to trying to make the new stories and the new images and then raise the new questions that comes through artists who commit themselves to that path in their lives and who deserve the same attention and consideration as we shower on our potential Olympic athletes. And somehow out of those two things, and the commitment within local democracy to making a good life for people, for the citizens of an area, out of those three things, I believe, because my glass is still, because I haven't been drinking from it, over half full, I believe that there's a unique opportunity for a new generation, not my generation, but a new generation, to actually refine the kind of energy and commitment that I experienced in South Africa, the kind of energy and commitment that I gave as a young man in the late 60s and into the early 70s, to reforge in this new digital age something which is simultaneously international and local and networked and committed to exploring the new questions, sharing them, and trying to improve with the public's money, the public environment within which we live. So that's me. Done.
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dance City, who host the events.